In the spring of 1869, demolition crews began tearing down the long-abandoned Blessed Widow's Christian home on East 42nd Street in Manhattan. What they uncovered would haunt New York City for generations. Hidden behind a false wall in the basement were 52 wooden coffins arranged in eerily perfect rows. Inside each lay the remains of an elderly woman. But these were no ordinary burials. Each skeleton wore expensive jewelry, and beside every coffin rested a handwritten ledger carefully detailing the woman's net worth down to the last penny. The most chilling detail, according to official records, not a single one of those 52 women had ever been declared dead at the institution. They hadn't died there, they had vanished. For 22 years, the Blessed Widow's Christian Home had operated as one of Manhattan's most respected charities, serving poor widows. It had been celebrated in the press, endorsed by prominent churches, and admired for its apparent piety. Yet every wealthy widow who entered those doors had signed over her fortune, and then disappeared without a trace. Before we peel back the layers of horror behind these 52 vanished souls, if you're someone who dares to remember the stories most would rather forget, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Sleepy History Tales isn't for everyone. It's for the few who seek out the darkest corners of American history. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? We'd love to know where our brave community of history seekers calls home. What made the discovery even more disturbing was what came next. An investigation that exposed a meticulously designed system of murder operating in plain sight, blessed by the church and celebrated by society for over 2 decades. The killer's methods was so refined, so cleverly cloaked in the trappings of Christian charity, that even the most suspicious minds never thought to question what happened behind those welcoming doors. Back in the 1840s, Manhattan was a city of extremes, and it was those extremes that created the perfect conditions for one of America's most elegantly hidden atrocities. As the wealthy built marble mansions along Fifth Avenue gleaming in the afternoon sun, thousands of immigrants crammed into crumbling tenements that stretched from the Bowery to the Hudson. A vast human sea of desperation. The very air betrayed the city's brutal inequalities. Light and perfumed uptown, thick with cold smoke and misery downtown, where hope went to die, where hope. Among the most vulnerable were elderly widows, women who had lost their husbands and were left to survive alone in a hostile city with no real family support and even fewer legal protections. At the time, a woman's property automatically became her husband's when she married. Widowhood, even for the well-off, often meant destitution. Many found their husbands, partners, or relatives had already claimed their estates, leaving them with nothing but memories and the clothes on their backs. It was into this fragile, dangerous world that Margaret O'Brien stepped in 1845, offering what she claimed was salvation. The Blessed Widow's Christian Home stood at 127 East 42nd Street, a 3-story brownstone that had once been a private mansion, now converted into a sanctuary with careful attention to dignity and design. Its facade was painted a warm cream that caught the morning light just right, with black shutters that were always perfectly maintained, and flower boxes filled with seasonal blooms that changed with clockwork precision. A polished brass plaque beside the heavy oak front door read, "Blessed Widow's Christian Home, founded 1845, a haven for God's forgotten daughters. Margaret O'Brien was a woman who knew exactly how to inspire trust. When she founded the institution, she was 40 years old, tall and commanding, but not intimidating. Her steel-grey hair was always pulled back in a tidy bun that suggested both devotion and discipline. Her clothing was modest, but fine dark tones that spoke of virtue fabrics that whispered quiet prosperity without ever suggesting indulgence. But it was her eyes that people remembered. Pale blue, sharp as ice. Eyes that seemed to see right through you. Her eyes could shift with remarkable ease, radiating maternal warmth at public gatherings, then hardening into unyielding authority in private conversations. Margaret O'Brien claimed to be an Irish immigrant who had arrived in New York in 1839 carrying flawless references from Catholic charities in Boston. She spoke with just enough of an Irish lilt to sound authentic, but never so thick as to seem foreign or unpolished. Her origin story, which she shared sparingly and always with carefully timed emotion, described a comfortable childhood in County Cork, a brief but loving marriage to a successful merchant who died young of consumption, and a divine calling to serve God by caring for women who had endured similar heartbreak. But O'Brien didn't run the home alone. She surrounded herself with two trusted companions, each bringing a different strength that made the institution appear well-rounded and trustworthy. Catherine Kelly served as the head caretaker and medical attendant. She was a small, wiry woman in her mid-30s, her brown hair streaked with grey, her hands always moving, sewing hems, scrubbing surfaces, counting pills, or scribbling careful notes about each resident's condition. She moved through the house like someone who knew every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of a draft, every strange sound that signaled something was amiss. According to her references, she had trained as a nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital and had years of experience tending to the elderly in private homes across New England. Completing the trio was Father Patrick Walsh, the home's chaplain and spiritual guide. Walsh was strikingly young for a priest, just shy of 30, with dark hair that curled no matter how sternly he tried to slick it down. His brown eyes radiated kindness, and he had a presence that made elderly women want to care for him, while younger women occasionally forgot themselves in his company. Still, he carried himself with a dignity that matched his vocation. His greatest gift was his voice, deep, warm, and smooth, equally suited for quiet confessions and resounding sermons. Together, the three created what seemed to be a model Christian charity. A mission statement engraved on a bronze plaque in the entry hall declared their purpose: to provide loving Christian care for widowed women of good character who find themselves without family support in their twilight years, that they might live their remaining days in dignity surrounded by sisters in faith and pass into eternal rest with the comfort of knowing they have been loved. The institution ran on a tiered system that appeared both practical and compassionate. Wealthier widows could pay a generous entrance fee, earning access to private second-floor suites, personalized nursing care, customized meals, and help managing correspondence and financial matters. For those with fewer resources, there were options too. Women of modest means could contribute by working in the kitchen garden or laundry. They shared third-floor dormitories but still joined all religious services and social gatherings, equals in the eyes of God. The building itself had been renovated with care to feel like a home, not a hospital. The entrance hall featured polished mahogany wainscoting and wallpaper in delicate floral prints, creating the air of a quiet, respectable residence. On one wall hung a large oil painting of Christ blessing the children. On the other, framed portraits of past residents labeled with their names and the simple phrase, "O'Brien preferred," graduated to their eternal reward. The ground floor of the Blessed Widow's Christian home served as the heart of daily life, housing the common areas where residents spent most of their time. The sitting room was warm and inviting, furnished with soft armchairs arranged in cozy clusters for conversation. Tables stood ready for card games or needlework, and bookshelves lined the walls, filled with religious texts, newspapers, and an ever-growing library of well-loved novels and periodicals. Large windows overlooked the rear garden, bathing the space in natural light and offering views of the flower beds, which several residents lovingly tended as part of their daily contributions. Just beyond the dining room offered space for all 30 residents seated comfortably at 3 long tables dressed in crisp white linen. Each place setting featured proper china and silverware, small but meaningful details that reflected the home's commitment to dignity and refinement. Meals were served with military precision breakfast at 7:00 to dinner at noon and supper at 6 hours. Residents were expected to dress modestly and observe good table manners, reinforcing the home's atmosphere of respect and order. The kitchen, a well-organized and modern facility for its time, was the domain of Catherine Kelly. There, she directed meal preparation with the help of several residents who worked to earn their keep. A large coal-burning stove, spacious counters, and a fully stocked pantry made the kitchen efficient and productive. Kelly insisted on using fresh vegetables from the garden whenever possible, and she had long-standing arrangements with local butchers, dairies, and grocers to provide high-quality ingredients. On the second floor were the private rooms reserved for premium residents, those who had contributed a substantial entrance fee. Each room was furnished with a bed, wardrobe, writing desk, and an upholstered chair, and was individually decorated to reflect the occupants' tastes. Residents were encouraged to bring personal belongings, keepsakes, and family photographs to make their rooms feel like home. At the end of the hall, a small library offered additional books and a tranquil space for reading and quiet reflection. The third floor housed the shared accommodations for working residents as well as the staff quarters. Though more modest than the rooms below, these spaces were still clean, orderly, and maintained with the same care and attention to detail. No corner of the home was allowed to feel institutional. Every room carried the warmth of a carefully curated sanctuary, yet perhaps the most sacred space in the entire building was the chapel installed by O'Brien in what had once been the mansion's grand ballroom. The room featured vaulted ceilings, stained glass windows depicting scenes from the life of Christ, and wooden pews that seated every resident comfortably. At the front stood a simple yet elegant altar, adorned with a marble cross and framed by fresh flowers that residents took turns arranging from the garden. Every morning at precisely 6:30, the home's day began with communal prayer in this chapel. Father Walsh held daily Catholic Mass while also offering non-denominational services for the Protestant women. His sermons focused on themes that touched deep emotional chords. charity forgiveness, the challenge of accepting God's will during hardship, and the spiritual importance of releasing earthly possessions in preparation for eternal life. The daily routine was structured but never stifling crafted to provide a sense of rhythm and security while still allowing for individual freedom. After morning prayers and breakfast, residents were free to spend their time as they wished. Many gathered again in the sitting room for conversation or to work on quilts, clothing repairs, or handcrafted items that were sold at local markets to help support the home. The garden behind the house was a favorite retreat, especially in warmer months. Residents tended to flower beds and vegetable plots, harvested herbs and greens for the kitchen, or simply sat beneath shady trees, enjoying the peace and privacy. The garden was enclosed by a high brick wall, shielding the space from the city's noise and offering security and stillness. The gates remained locked except during scheduled outdoor hours. Reading and discussion was strongly encouraged. In addition to religious texts, the home subscribed to newspapers and magazines, ensuring that residents stayed informed. O'Brien often led evening discussions, selecting articles of interest and encouraging the women to reflect and share personal experiences or opinions. For many, these conversations were not just intellectually stimulating, they were a source of connection, memory, and healing. Evening meals at the Blessed Widow's Christian home were more than just a time to eat. They were sacred social rituals where residents exchanged stories from their past lives, voiced their hopes and worries, and forged the friendships that gave the home its rare sense of true community. Margaret O'Brien often dined with the women herself, moving from table to table with gentle questions and keen eyes, taking note of every concern, no matter how small. What made the Blessed Widow's Christian home so appealing to potential residents wasn't just its warmth or its faith, it was its reputation for dignity and personalized care. In a city where elderly women were often either shoved into overcrowded almshouses with barely enough food or medical attention, or left to fend for themselves after being priced out of private care, O'Brien's institution offered a third path, a middle ground that felt both compassionate and practical. The staff-to-resident ratio was almost unheard of for its time, one staff member for every 6 women. That meant each resident received true attention, whether for medical needs, spiritual counseling, or even just emotional comfort. Catherine Kelly maintained meticulous records tracking everything from blood pressure to preferred meal times to sleeping habits. Nothing was left to chance. Meanwhile, Father Walsh made himself available for private counseling, offering quiet moments of spiritual reflection, or simply a kind ear for grief-stricken or anxious women. But perhaps the most valuable service of all, especially for the women who came with tangled pasts and uncertain futures, was the home's assistance with legal and financial matters. O'Brien, it turned out, was surprisingly knowledgeable in inheritance law and estate planning. She frequently sat down with residents to help them organize their affairs, arrange meetings with attorneys, draft new wills, or update old ones. She was known for making complex decisions feel manageable, guiding women through the labyrinth of rights and risks that came with aging alone. This particular service became one of the home's most trusted offerings. Many women arrived with their finances in disarray, unsure of what they were entitled to or how to protect what little remained. O'Brien helped them regain control, to understand their options, to feel safe, seen, and heard. Word spread quickly. Soon the home was receiving steady referrals, not only from former residents and their families, but from lawyers across the city who had come to trust O'Brien's discretion and professionalism. If a client needed both housing and legal help, the Blessed Widow's Christian Home was the first name mentioned. But all of that trust, all of that peace was quietly tested on the morning of November 15th, 1847. A sharp autumn wind rattled the windows as the women gathered in the chapel for their morning prayers. Wool skirts rustled softly, and whispered greetings echoed gently through the space as each woman took her place in the familiar wooden pews. As 6:30 a.m. struck and Father Walsh stepped solemnly to the altar, a subtle but unmistakable shift in mood spread across the room. Something was off. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore was missing. It wasn't just unusual, it was unthinkable. Mrs. Whitmore was the very embodiment of routine and reliability. In the 6 months since she had arrived at the home, the 73-year-old widow had never once missed a prayer, a meal, or even a sewing circle. She lived by the clock. Her hair, a lustrous silver, was always arranged in the same elegant chignon. Her dresses were always freshly pressed. Her spine remained straight as ever, a testament to a life built on discipline and grace. The day before, she had seemed perfectly healthy, chatting warmly during the needlework circle, telling stories from her late husband's shipping empire, and talking excitedly about writing letters to distant family members in Philadelphia. She had been especially eager to contact a grandniece who had just become engaged. That evening, she had glowed. At supper, Mrs. Whitmore reminisced about Christmases past and asked Catherine Kelly about the home's upcoming holiday plans. She laughed easily. She seemed full of energy, but now she was gone. As the minutes passed and her absence became undeniable, a quiet tension descended. Finally, Catherine Kelly stood from her place near the back of the chapel. Her usual composure wavered. For the first time, the ever-efficient caretaker seemed unsettled. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted her apron. Her normally swift steps faltered, uncertain. Whatever had happened to Eleanor Whitmore, whatever was about to unfold, would mark the beginning of a terrible unraveling. When Catherine Kelly reached the front of the chapel, she turned slowly to face the gathered women. Her eyes were brimming with tears that traced wet lines down her cheeks. "Dear sisters," she began, her voice quivering with what seemed to be genuine grief, "I must share heartbreaking news with you all. Our beloved Mrs. Whitmore passed peacefully in her sleep during the night. Father Walsh was able to provide last rites, and she spoke of how grateful she was to have found such a loving family here with all of us. Her final words were about how blessed she felt to spend her last days among faithful Christian women. A wave of shock rippled through the chapel, almost physical in its force. Gasps broke the silence. Some women wept openly, while others exchanged looks of disbelief and confusion. Mrs. Whitmore had shown no signs of illness, no hints of fatigue, no weakness. Just the night before, she had been laughing at dinner, animated and full of life, recounting memories with her usual wit and warmth. Sarah Brennan, a sharp-minded 68-year-old resident who had lived at the home for nearly 2 years, felt an uneasy chill knot itself in her stomach. Something about the announcement didn't sit right with her. She couldn't say exactly why. Perhaps it was the suddenness or maybe the timing. But a sense of wrongness coiled quietly within her. Father Walsh stepped forward to speak, offering comfort as only he could. His voice, deep and resonant, filled the space with familiar cadences of prayer and scripture words meant to soothe. He spoke of the unpredictability of God's calling, of the blessing of a peaceful passing, and the Christian promise of resurrection and eternal life. It was the sort of sermon that typically brought peace to troubled hearts. Yet Mrs. Brennan wasn't listening to his words. She was watching his face. There was something off, a subtle absence of true sorrow, a too perfect calm, as if he had known before anyone else what would be said today. His grief felt rehearsed, controlled, but what disturbed her most was the speed with which everything was arranged. By midday, Mrs. Whitmore's body had already been removed from the home by undertakers. Over lunch, Margaret O'Brien announced that she had been buried in a simple ceremony at Calvary Cemetery in Queens, allegedly in accordance with Mrs. Whitmore's explicit final wishes. Just last week, O'Brien explained with her usual balance of authority and compassion. Mrs. Whitmore told me she wanted a quiet burial with no fuss or ceremony. She didn't want to burden her new family here with prolonged mourning. She believed excessive grief was selfish. Instead, she wanted us to celebrate her journey to eternal peace, not dwell on our own sorrow. It was the kind of explanation that on the surface sounded admirable pious even. But to Mrs. Brennan, the story didn't add up. In all the months they had been friends, Mrs. Whitmore had never once expressed a desire for a quiet burial. On the contrary, she often spoke of the lavish funeral her late husband had received with a gleam of pride and nostalgia. It had been, in her words, a proper tribute to a life well lived. Why would she choose something so starkly different for herself? Mrs. Brennan's discomfort only grew when she approached O'Brien with a request to visit Mrs. Whitmore's grave and pay her respects. O'Brien's response was gentle but immovable. She placed a warm maternal hand on Brennan's shoulder. "I understand your desire to honor her memory, dear," she said softly. "But her family relatives from Philadelphia arrived yesterday to make arrangements. They've asked for complete privacy during this difficult time. They feel that visits from non-family members would only prolong their grief and interfere with accepting God's will." The mention of family stopped Mrs. Brennan cold. Family. In 6 months of near daily conversation with Mrs. Whitmore, there had never been any mention of relatives in Philadelphia, aside from a distant grandniece with whom she corresponded occasionally. No brothers, no children, no sisters or cousins. Mrs. Whitmore had often said how alone she felt in the world, how this home had become her only family. The unease within Sarah Brennan grew deeper. She could no longer brush it aside. Something wasn't right. And now, for the first time, she was beginning to suspect that what happened to Mrs. Whitmore might not have been natural at all. Mrs. Whitmore had always presented herself as a woman largely alone in the world. She spoke of only distant family connections, relatives she rarely saw or corresponded with. Her stories told in soft tones over shared tea or evening walks in the garden painted a picture of a woman whose past had grown quiet. With time, her world reduced to memories and a few cherished keepsakes. But the mystery surrounding her death deepened when Mrs. Brennan made a troubling discovery. Nearly all of Mrs. Whitmore's personal belongings had vanished with startling efficiency. Her ornate jewelry box, which contained several valuable heirlooms inherited from her mother. Her leather-bound journal in which she'd recorded daily reflections and observations about life at the home, and her collection of photographs and handwritten letters, items she referred to as her last living connections, all gone. When Mrs. Brennan asked about these possessions, Catherine Kelly offered an explanation that mirrored the official story. The belongings had been sent to relatives in Philadelphia per Mrs. Whitmore's written instructions. Her tone, though polite, carried a faint edge of irritation, as if questioning these details were in poor taste. She left very specific directions, Kelly explained, folding her hands tightly. She wanted to ensure that nothing would be wasted or forgotten. It was truly touching how thoroughly she planned for her departure from this world. But Brennan wasn't convinced. Just days before her sudden death, Mrs. Whitmore had spoken openly about dividing her jewelry among her friends. She had even told Brennan personally that she intended to leave her pearl brooch to her, a small but deeply meaningful token of their growing friendship. The memory of that conversation now burned in Brennan's mind. In the weeks that followed, as the home's routine settled back into its familiar rhythm, Mrs. Brennan began to see patterns she had previously ignored, moments that now seemed to pulse with quiet warning. Mrs. Whitmore, it turned out, had not been the first. Since Brennan's arrival 2 years earlier, 5 other women had died under similarly quiet and convenient circumstances. There was Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, age 70, who arrived with a generous inheritance from her late husband's textile empire. In February 1846, just 4 months after moving in, she passed away unexpectedly on a night when she'd appeared in perfect health. Her burial too had been private, with no notice to the other residents. Then came Mrs. Ruth Patterson, who died in August 1846, another wealthy widow who had paid a large entrance fee and then slipped quietly away in the night. Next, Mrs. Catherine Donnelly in January 1847, Mrs. Margaret Sullivan in June 1847, and Mrs. Elizabeth Hayes in September 1847. All 5 women shared the same pattern: sudden nighttime death. No warning signs, an immediate burial, quietly and without witnesses. But the most chilling realization struck when Mrs. Brennan tried to confirm the deaths in public records. Given their social standing, one would expect obituaries or at least brief death notices. After all, Mrs. Morrison had been respected in New York's textile circles. Mrs. Patterson had volunteered in prominent charities. Mrs. Donnelly's husband had once been a major player in the shipping industry. Yet, in newspaper after newspaper, Brennan found nothing. No mention, no acknowledgement. It was as if these women had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only their wealth and empty rooms. Then something unexpected happened. One afternoon at the local market, Mrs. Brennan ran into Mary O'Sullivan, a former housekeeper who had worked for Mrs. Morrison for over 15 years. When Brennan gently informed her of Mrs. Morrison's passing, O'Sullivan's face fell in disbelief. "I had no idea," she said, visibly shaken. "She always said she'd send for me if she ever got ill. She treated me like family." The 2 women sat down at a nearby cafe, sharing a pot of tea. while O'Sullivan recounted her confusion and grief. "I kept waiting to hear from her after she moved into that place," she said softly. "She promised to write every week. I never got a single letter. Not one." And in that moment, another piece of the puzzle slid into place, a new thread in the tapestry of quiet disappearances. None of the deceased women had maintained contact with their former lives after entering the Blessed Widow's Christian home. Servants, former acquaintances, business partners, even distant relatives were left to wonder about the sudden silence from women who had once been thoughtful, frequent correspondents. Letters simply stopped. Promises to stay in touch were broken without explanation. The trail went cold as winter settled over Manhattan in early 1848. The atmosphere inside the home began to shift subtly, almost imperceptibly, but unmistakably so for anyone paying close attention. Mrs. Sarah Brennan, now alert to signs she might have dismissed, before began to observe daily routines with new eyes. What once seemed like the comforting rhythm of a well-run institution now revealed patterns of intentional choreography. On the surface, nothing had changed. Meals continued to be served with punctual grace. Religious services followed their familiar cadence. The staff remained attentive and courteous, almost too courteous. Brennan began to think. The building still radiated its carefully cultivated aura of compassion and Christian charity. But beneath that serene facade, Brennan began to detect currents of manipulation, slow, methodical, and profoundly disturbing. Margaret O'Brien, it became clear, possessed a particular talent for identifying and cultivating relationships with residents who held substantial financial assets. During seemingly casual conversations in the dining room or the sitting parlor, O'Brien would steer the dialogue ever so gently toward personal history, family connections, and most importantly, financial matters. "It must bring such peace," she would say softly, leaning in with warm concern, "to know your dear husband made arrangements for your comfort. Have you had help organizing things since his passing? So many widows find themselves overwhelmed by the complexities of inheritance law these days." Her interest always appeared to be maternal benevolent, even comforting. But Mrs. Brennan had come to recognize the pattern beneath the charm. These conversations often led to offers of assistance, framed as thoughtful acts of kindness. O'Brien would recommend trusted lawyers or discreet accountants, professionals she claimed had served other residents faithfully. She spoke fluently about estate law, probate, and inheritance taxes. "It brings such peace of mind," she would say, eyes shining with conviction, "to know that all we've worked for will go on to bless God's children, even after we've left this world behind." Residents who named the home in their wills were praised, gently held up as examples of faithful stewardship and Christian duty. They rest easier knowing their earthly treasures will provide comfort to other widows in need. It wasn't just O'Brien. Father Walsh, too, had refined his approach. His sermons and private counseling sessions began to emphasize certain themes, with increasing frequency: the vanity of earthly possessions, the spiritual virtue of sacrifice, and the eternal reward that came from detaching oneself from material wealth. He quoted scripture with scholarly confidence, his voice rich and steady. Our Lord himself taught that we cannot serve both God and money. The pursuit of earthly treasure often binds us when our spirits should be free. We must prepare our hearts for the kingdom, not the counting house. His theological arguments were persuasive, especially to elderly women raised to revere the authority of the church. Many emerged from his sessions changed, speaking of the peace they felt after deciding to simplify their wills, or how they no longer feared death now that their earthly burdens had been lightened. Even the more skeptical residents found it difficult to resist the combined power of his intelligence, sincerity, and spiritual authority. And then there was Catherine Kelly, the quiet backbone of the operation. Her role was less public, but no less critical. As the home's medical attendant, she maintained detailed health records for every resident. Her recommendations carried great weight, shaped by her reputation as a skilled and compassionate nurse. She knew who took which medications, who required dietary changes, who slept restlessly, or reported vague aches and pains. Her constant presence and apparent expertise built trust. And that trust gave her unfettered access to the most vulnerable aspects of each woman's life, their bodies, their minds, and their vulnerabilities. None of these efforts on their own appeared sinister, but taken together, viewed through the lens of growing suspicion, Mrs. Brennan could no longer ignore the conclusion that slowly, silently formed in her mind. The home did not merely offer care. It curated dependency. It cultivated surrender. Catherine Kelly had quietly developed a specialty that few questioned and even fewer understood. She had become adept at identifying which residents suffered from insomnia, anxiety, or chronic discomfort conditions common among elderly women and easily treatable with a popular and legal remedy of the time, laudanum. Laudanum, a potent mixture of alcohol and opium, was widely prescribed in the 19th century. Though considered safe by contemporary standards, its addictive properties were well known to those who understood its chemistry. And Kelly did. Her protocols appeared entirely reasonable. She would begin with small doses offered in soft tones and explained with the calm reassurance of a practiced nurse. Many older women find their sleep patterns change with age, Kelly would say, almost motherly in her delivery. There's no need to suffer night after night. A small dose of this herbal tonic can help restore natural rest, and your health depends on proper rest. It seemed like compassionate care. But Mrs. Brennan, now watchful and wary, had begun connecting the dots. Her growing unease reached a terrible climax in late February 1848 on a bitterly cold night. Unable to sleep due to arthritis pain, Brennan rose from her bed just after midnight to pace the halls, a quiet ritual that usually soothed her joints. The house was dark, and still the gas lamps turned low, the silence broken only by the creak of wood beneath her slippers. But as she passed the main stairwell, she noticed something strange light spilling out from beneath the door to Margaret O'Brien's office, a room that was typically locked after hours. Her first thought was concern. Perhaps someone was ill. Perhaps a resident needed help. But as she approached, a chill ran down her spine. The door was ajar just enough to see inside. O'Brien sat at her desk, her posture upright and composed. Beside her stood Catherine Kelly, flipping through a notebook filled with her neat clinical handwriting. Father Walsh leaned close, his hands clasped behind his back. The three of them were gathered in a quiet huddle of focus and intent. The desk was covered in legal documents, small brown bottles, a heavy leather-bound ledger, and a drawstring pouch of coins. The soft metallic clings occasionally punctuating their conversation like a metronome of quiet dread. Brennan remained still unseen in the shadows as O'Brien's voice reached her ears. The new resident, Mrs. Patterson, mentioned her late husband's shipping investments again today, O'Brien said, as she made precise entries into the ledger. Catherine's estimate puts her assets at no less than $15,000, possibly more. No children, no family except a nephew in Boston she sees maybe once every few years. Father Walsh nodded solemnly. She's been very faithful in attending our counseling sessions, he said. She's open, impressionable, concerned about the morality of her wealth while others suffer. With some encouragement, I believe she can be guided toward a perspective of spiritual surrender, a belief in the virtue of giving all to God. Giving. Excellent, O'Brien said, her tone businesslike. But we must move carefully. We can't afford another transition so soon. Mrs. Henderson passed only 6 weeks ago, and Mrs. Whitmore's departure was just 3 months back. The spacing needs to be maintained. Let's wait another month before initiating formal steps with Mrs. Patterson. Kelly opened her notebook. Her voice was clinical. She's already on laudanum, though I've labeled it as a special herbal tincture. She believes it's something I prepare myself. The dose is small for now, but she's adjusting quickly. Her comfort level with evening medication is increasing nicely. When the time comes stepping up, the dosage will raise no suspicion. Walsh looked up from his hands and her legal preparations. O'Brien smiled, not coldly, but with the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching a careful plan unfold. She's mentioned concerns about her nephew's gambling debts. I've suggested that she might consider a legacy that reflects her values. Something charitable, something eternal. When the time is right, I'll encourage her to leave her estate to the home. For a long moment, Mrs. Brennan could not breathe. It was all there, the targeting, the manipulation, the sedative compliance, the financial grooming. Everything she feared was not only true, it was worse. This wasn't opportunism. This was a system, a machine of piety and poison run with surgical precision behind curtains of charity and stained glass sanctity. She stepped backward, retreating silently into the dark corridor, her knees trembling, her breath shallow. The candle light from under the door seemed to flicker like a warning. She now knew too much. These were not caretakers. These were predators. And what Mrs. Brennan had overheard that night was nothing less than the calm, clinical planning of a murder. Mrs. Patterson's death, still in the future, was being orchestrated like a business transaction, its timeline, dosage, and legal arrangements laid out with chilling precision. The horrifying truth settled over Mrs. Brennan like a shroud. Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Whitmore, and the others had not died peacefully in their sleep. They had been systematically murdered, not in a moment of rage or desperation, but as part of an ongoing operation. An operation so cold-blooded, so calculated, that it transformed the respectable walls of the blessed widow's Christian home into something far darker. A killing machine disguised as sanctuary. She backed away from the office door without a sound, every heartbeat pounding like a drumbeat of dread. Once safely in her room, She sat frozen for hours, her hands trembling, her mind racing. Sleep was impossible. Her thoughts circled endlessly. How long had this been happening? How many victims had there been? Who could she tell? Would they believe her? And most terrifying of all, was she next? The weeks that followed were the most dangerous of Mrs. Brennan's life. She knew she was walking a razor's edge. One wrong move, one suspicious glance, one misplaced question, and she could easily find herself in the same quiet grave as Mrs. Whitmore. But she also knew she had no choice. She could not stand by and watch more women be slaughtered under the guise of Christian care. Her first mission was to discover the true identities of the home's 3 overseers. She reasoned that if they were capable of murder, they were almost certainly capable of lying about their qualifications. She used her weekly visits to the local market, ostensibly for bread soap or sewing supplies, as a cover for discreet investigation. Her breakthrough came during a conversation with Mr. Timothy Flanagan, the elderly clerk at St. Patrick's Cathedral, who maintained detailed records of every priest assigned to the Archdiocese of New York. As Mrs. Brennan casually praised the spiritual comfort provided by Father Walsh, Flanagan's reaction caught her off guard. "Father Walsh, you say?" He repeated, his bushy white eyebrows knitting together. "I don't believe we have anyone by that name in the Archdiocese. Could you be thinking of Father William Walsh from St. Mary's? He's been there almost 20 years, but he's much older than the man you're describing." When Mrs. Brennan described the chaplain in more detail, his youth, dark curly hair, gentle manner, Flanagan grew visibly confused. "No, I'm certain. There is no Father Patrick Walsh registered with the Archdiocese of New York. And if he'd been recently ordained, especially someone that young and articulate, I'd know." His words left Brennan cold. Whoever this man was, he had no clerical standing in New York. And from the way he sometimes stumbled over Latin phrases during Mass, phrases any properly trained priest would know by heart, she began to suspect he wasn't ordained at all. She began watching him more closely, though his sermons were moving and his knowledge of Scripture appeared deep. Brennan noticed subtle inconsistencies. At times, his Latin pronunciation wavered, betraying uncertainty. Once she saw him practicing alone in the chapel, mouthing Latin phrases from a small worn book, repeating each one with the effort of a student, not a spiritual guide. Her suspicions deepened. She turned her attention to Catherine Kelly, the home's industrious and sharp-eyed medical attendant. According to Kelly, she had trained at Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the country's most reputable medical institutions. But through a delicate conversation with Mary O'Sullivan, Mrs. Morrison's former housekeeper Brennan learned of a connection that could help confirm or disprove this claim. Mary's brother Patrick O'Sullivan worked as a porter at that very hospital. A few days later, over tea in a corner booth of a quiet shop, Mary shared what her brother had reported. "Patrick says he's worked there more than 10 years, knows nearly every nurse who's passed through the wards," Mary whispered. "And he's certain there's never been a Catherine Kelly on staff. Not during the time she claims, not ever." Mrs. Brennan's heart dropped. It was now clear that both the chaplain and the nurse had invented their credentials. And if they had lied about who they were, What else had they fabricated? The final, most damning revelation came during a rare opportunity when Margaret O'Brien left the home to meet with potential donors in Midtown. Brennan, having observed the staff's schedules for months, knew this was one of the few times the director's office would be unguarded. With every nerve in her body alive with tension, she slipped inside. The office was dimly lit by the afternoon sun filtering through lace curtains. The scent of beeswax and old books filled the air. A locked drawer yielded quickly to a hidden key she'd watched O'Brien retrieve weeks earlier from a loose floorboard behind the bookshelf. Inside was a treasure trove of horrors, dozens of legal documents, wills, powers of attorney, estate transfers, all stamped, notarized, and signed by trembling hands. Some bore names Brennan recognized, others were unfamiliar, all of them designated Margaret O'Brien or the Blessed Widow's Christian Home as sole beneficiaries. There were ledgers, 2 carefully handwritten entries tracking each woman's arrival, net worth, health status, medication regimen, and most chilling of all, a final date. Some dates were in the past, some still to come. Brennan closed the drawer, her hands shaking. She now had evidence. She had proof of murder, but escaping with it and living long enough to expose the truth would be another matter entirely. The office was typically kept locked, but Mrs. Brennan had observed Catherine Kelly entering it frequently, using a key that hung from a ring at her waist. On a Tuesday morning, while Kelly was occupied downstairs with the weekly laundry out of sight and earshot, Mrs. Brennan seized her chance. Producing a hairpin from the bun in her hair, she knelt before the door. It took only moments. The lock was simple, and she'd learned the skill decades ago from a mischievous older brother who once fancied himself a magician. Inside the office smelled of paper ink and lavender polish. It was neat, meticulously so. But as she quietly searched through drawers and cabinets, Mrs. Brennan's pulse quickened. Most compartments held nothing suspicious: receipts, donation letters, appointment books. Then, as she tried to close the center drawer of the desk, it jammed. She adjusted its angle slightly, and her fingers caught on a small wooden lip. It gave way with a soft click. Behind the false panel lay a hidden cache of documents, and with it, the true extent of the nightmare. Stacked neatly in brown folders were copies of wills, all bearing signatures from now deceased residents. All left the bulk of their estates to the Blessed Widow's Christian Home. The handwriting on some was shaky and inconsistent, signed perhaps under duress or sedation. But more disturbing still was the ledger. It was a thick book bound in worn black leather, its pages filled with handwritten entries in O'Brien's tidy looping script. Each entry chronicled the death of a resident name, date, value of estate transferred method used to gain compliance. It read less like an accounting book and more like a murder log. In just 3 years, the home had absorbed over $300,000 from the deaths of 21 women, and each entry included terrifying notations. Laudanum increased gradually over 6 weeks. Documents signed while heavily sedated. Death occurred as planned. Burial arranged within 8 hours. No family inquiries received. Mrs. Brennan's stomach turned as she turned the pages. The evidence was undeniable. These weren't natural deaths. They were executions, masked by piety and efficiency. Then she found a second ledger, thinner, newer, and far worse. This book contained plans, names of current residents, their estimated net worth, brief psychological profiles, and proposed dates of death. The most immediate was Mrs. Patterson, whose transition was scheduled for just 6 weeks away. Her projected inheritance, $18,000. 5 other residents were listed below, and among them, Mrs. Brennan's own name. Next to it, in a different pen, someone had written, potentially problematic due to intelligence and observational skills. May require special handling. The words felt like a blow to the chest. Cold dread poured through her, but it was not paralyzing. Beneath the terror was a growing flame of fury and determination. She could no longer save the 21 women already buried, but she could try to save the next. Working swiftly and silently, Mrs. Brennan committed the contents of the most damning documents to memory, studying names, dates, and amounts. Then she carefully returned everything to its precise place, closed the drawer, and relocked the door just as Kelly's footsteps echoed faintly from below. But it wasn't only the murders. Among the most disturbing items were letters, hidden correspondence from O'Brien to other so-called charitable homes in Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. The contents confirmed the existence of a network stretching across several states. Directors shared strategies, methods, and even referred vulnerable widows to one another when circumstances required relocation. One letter, dated just 2 months prior, warned of complications in Philadelphia and advised O'Brien to prepare for evacuation and clean closure procedures. The letter was signed simply Sister Margaret. Another included a list of best practices: how to sedate without raising suspicion, how to coach residents into will revisions, and how to ensure local authorities remained unaware. O'Brien's files also revealed how she had built the home's shining reputation. She had donated thousands stolen from her victims to churches, newspapers, and charitable societies across New York. She had hosted lavish teas, invited city leaders to tour the facility, and ensured glowing write-ups appeared in Catholic bulletins and women's magazines. It was a masterclass in public image management. Financial records revealed that after paying staff, maintaining the building, and funding public relations efforts, each of the 3 conspirators had amassed personal fortunes. Mrs. Brennan calculated the figures with cold detachment, over $100,000 each, hidden in various accounts and likely under false names. She had seen enough. The truth was not only monstrous, it was interstate industrialized murder masquerading as mercy. And now they knew who she was, and worse, she now knew what they were capable of. They had funneled much of their stolen wealth into legitimate businesses and prime city real estate, constructing the image of successful, civic-minded philanthropists while amassing quiet personal fortunes. Their public reputations were beyond reproach. And now, armed with overwhelming evidence of their crimes, Mrs. Brennan faced an impossible choice, one that became more urgent with each passing day. She could not simply walk away. Residents who had expressed a desire to leave were always gently yet firmly persuaded to stay. Those who insisted too forcefully often fell mysteriously ill, their health deteriorating within days. Their exits, like their lives, were abruptly and efficiently terminated. She had seen it happen with Mrs. Adelaide Foster, a sharp-witted widow who had declared her intent to move in with a cousin in Boston. A week later, she was dead. The official cause pneumonia. But Mrs. Brennan remembered clearly Adelaide hadn't coughed once. Going to the authorities was no simple matter either. The Blessed Widow's Christian Home enjoyed an impeccable reputation, endorsed by the church, supported by prominent benefactors, and frequently featured in glowing newspaper write-ups. O'Brien herself rubbed shoulders with judges, councilmen, and bishops, all of whom would likely dismiss accusations from a confused old woman as the result of senility or grief. And now they were watching her. Catherine Kelly had begun to appear at unusual moments, always polite, always smiling, but with eyes that watched too closely. She asked questions that carried a quiet weight. "You've seemed a little restless lately," dear Kelly observed one morning as she passed out medications. "Are you sleeping well? I sometimes hear footsteps in the hallway at night. I hope your joints aren't troubling you." It was framed as concern, but Mrs. Brennan recognized it for what it was, an evaluation. Father Walsh had also increased his attention. Despite her polite refusals, he now insisted on weekly spiritual counseling sessions, always delivered with that same rich, honeyed voice and air of divine sympathy. But the topics he chose were anything but comforting. "I sense a heaviness in your heart," he would say. "So many women in your position find peace when they release their attachments to worldly burdens, especially when those burdens come with complicated legal entanglements." He spoke of death not as a fearsome event, but as a gift, a transition to eternal peace best facilitated by letting go of worldly affairs. It was a script. Mrs. Brennan recognized it now. She had heard Walsh deliver similar lines to Mrs. Patterson just weeks earlier. Margaret O'Brien, too, had begun probing under the guise of casual conversation. During evening teas and shared meals, she would gently ask about Mrs. Brennan's family finances and legal protections, always couched in terms of concern and sisterly advice. "I hope I'm not being too forward," O'Brien said one afternoon, resting a maternal hand on Brennan's forearm. "But I've noticed you don't receive letters. No nieces or nephews to speak of. And forgive me, but have you made arrangements for your affairs? It would be such a comfort to know everything is in order." She smiled with polished warmth, but her eyes searched for vulnerabilities. Mrs. Brennan saw it now with horrifying clarity. She was in the machine, and the gears had already begun to turn. Every conversation, every kind gesture, every prayer whispered over tea, a step in the process. The same process that had ended 21 other lives. They were preparing her for death with the same meticulous precision they had applied to Mrs. Whitmore, Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Foster. The difference was she knew, and she wasn't ready to die. Her situation became even more precarious when she began to suspect that her food and medications were no longer safe. At first, it was only a bitter aftertaste in her evening soup, subtle, almost dismissible. Then came the herbal tea that Catherine Kelly so kindly prepared for her arthritis, an odd brew that left her drowsy, disoriented, and confused far more than any common herbs should. When Mrs. Brennan began discreetly discarding the contents, pouring the tea into a potted fern, slipping her pills into a hidden pouch, the results were immediate and undeniable. Her thoughts became clearer. Her body steadied. Her dreams, once clouded and fragmented, returned to their natural rhythms. She was not just being monitored. She was being drugged, softened like meat before a kill. The crisis reached its terrible peak on the night of May 3rd, 1848. She woke with a jolt just past midnight. At first, she thought it was a sound from within her room, a shifting floorboard, or the creak of furniture. But then she heard it again, soft, measured footsteps in the corridor. Mrs. Brennan rose from bed and crept silently to the door, her heart thudding so hard she feared it might give her away. She bent to the keyhole. Through that narrow lens, she saw Catherine Kelly, her figure partially illuminated by the faint, muted glow of a lantern turned low. In her other hand, Kelly carried a small medical bag. Her movements were precise, practiced the quiet confidence of someone performing a well-rehearsed task. She stopped at Mrs. Patterson's door. Mrs. Brennan watched, breath held, as Kelly retrieved a master key from her apron and opened the lock with terrifying ease. Then she slipped inside and shut the door behind her. What followed were the longest 20 minutes of Mrs. Brennan's life. Every tick of the old hallway clock echoed like a cannon in her ears. Her mind screamed to act, to intervene, to bang on doors or call for help. But she knew that direct confrontation meant certain death, and perhaps worse, the swift silencing of her suspicions before she could ever share them. Still, the thought of staying idle, of letting another woman die, gnawed at her soul. At last the door creaked open again. Kelly emerged alone. The medical bag was gone. Her movements were calm, satisfied, the unhurried stride of someone who believed their work was complete. She locked the door behind her, turned, and walked back toward her own quarters, unhurried, unaware that someone had witnessed it all. Mrs. Brennan stood frozen, the weight of her own inaction pressing like a stone on her chest. But then clarity settled over her like ice. She would not let it happen again. As soon as Kelly's footsteps disappeared down the far end of the hall, Mrs. Brennan darted back to her room, retrieved the hairpin she always kept tucked in her brush, and returned to Mrs. Patterson's door. Her hands shook, but the old muscle memory of childhood mischief guided her. With a soft click, the lock yielded. She slipped inside. The room was dark, quiet, but not silent. Mrs. Patterson was breathing shallow but steady, her chest rising in fragile rhythm beneath the covers. The air smelled faintly of alcohol and bitter chemicals. On the nightstand sat an empty glass, the rim sticky with residue, and the unmistakable scent of laudanum mingled with something sharper, possibly chloral hydrate or another heavy sedative. Mrs. Brennan approached, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She touched Mrs. Patterson's wrist, a pulse but weak. Her lips were pale. Her skin was damp with sweat. She had arrived just in time. Mrs. Brennan glanced back at the closed door, fear tightening around her like a noose. There was no time to hesitate. She would have to act, and quickly. By the time Mrs. Brennan finished speaking, the stack of copied notes lay neatly before Detective Fitzgerald, stained faintly by the sweat of her trembling hands. The detective sat in silence for a long moment, his gaze shifting from the documents to the drawn, determined face of the elderly woman across from him. His initial disbelief had faded, replaced now by something sharper, the focus of a man who had just glimpsed the edges of a monstrous truth. You say you saw them discussing the next death, that they kept a ledger, he said, slowly tapping a calloused finger against the edge of one page. You say they've been doing this for years, carefully, quietly, always with the same result. Mrs. Brennan nodded. Her voice was hoarse but steady. And if you don't act today, Mrs. Patterson will be dead by tonight. The poison is still in her system. She only lived because I stopped it. Fitzgerald stood turning toward the window, staring out at the city below. The streets of New York bustled as usual, oblivious to the horror unfolding within the walls of a sanctuary that prided itself on Christian virtue. When he turned back, his voice was all business. "How soon can you take me to the home?" "Now," Mrs. Brennan whispered. "But we can't be seen. If they know you're coming, we'll approach quietly," Fitzgerald said, reaching for his coat. "I'll take 2 plainclothes men and a medical examiner. If what you say is true, we'll need a doctor to verify Mrs. Patterson's condition, and possibly autopsy some of the others if we can secure the grounds." He locked eyes with her. "You've done something brave, Mrs. Brennan, but you need to understand this will be dangerous. If they suspect we're coming, they could destroy the evidence, or worse, silence Mrs. Patterson permanently." "I know," she said, "but I won't leave her alone." Within an hour, Mrs. Brennan was back inside the home, escorted discreetly by 2 detectives posing as visiting clergy. Inspector Fitzgerald and the medical examiner followed shortly behind, hidden in a supply wagon arranged by one of his trusted men. Mrs. Brennan led them around to the kitchen entrance, one she knew was usually unguarded at that hour. Inside the home was quiet, too quiet. She guided the men quickly through the narrow service halls toward the second-floor corridor, praying that Mrs. Patterson had remained safely unconscious, that no one had entered the room since she left. As they neared the door, one of the detectives signaled for silence and drew a small revolver. Fitzgerald knocked gently. The door opened from within. Mrs. Patterson was awake, pale but upright, alive. The medical examiner rushed in to examine her. After a quick assessment, he looked up with a grim expression. "She's been drugged with laudanum, possibly laced with chloral or opium derivatives. But she's lucid now. Someone saved her." Mrs. Brennan exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. "We need to go to the office," she said. "O'Brien keeps everything in her desk. The drawer has a false back." Fitzgerald nodded and signaled to the others. "Secure the building. No one leaves." What followed was a scene that would be remembered for decades. In O'Brien's office, they found everything: the ledgers, the wills, the letters from other cities. Enough documentation to not only shut down the Blessed Widow's Christian home, but to launch investigations into 3 other homes operating similar schemes along the eastern seaboard. Margaret O'Brien was arrested mid-conversation with a city councilwoman still wearing her habitual calm, a shawl draped over one arm, like a politician in repose. Catherine Kelly, was taken into custody in the dispensary, her apron smeared with laudanum residue. "I was only helping them sleep," she kept saying. "They couldn't sleep without it." And Father Walsh, whose real name turned out to be Edward Mallory, a disgraced theology student with a record of fraud and expulsion from 3 seminaries, attempted to flee through a back stairwell. He was tackled by Fitzgerald himself. That summer, the case of the widow's Ledger murders became the most infamous criminal trial in New York's recent memory. But among the most enduring images to emerge from it all was that of Mrs. Sarah Brennan, gray-haired and iron-willed, standing in the courtroom as the star witness. Her testimony led to multiple convictions, saved countless lives, and changed how charitable institutions for the elderly were monitored across the state. When asked by a reporter weeks later why she had risked everything, she replied simply, "Because if I didn't, I'd have been next." Fitzgerald's team had unearthed the final crack in the facade, the discovery that Dr. Edmund Morrison, a disgraced physician known to the department, had been quietly employed to sign off on the deaths at the home without so much as examining the bodies, was the key that unlocked everything. With this, the forged wills, the silent burials, and the strategic lack of family interference suddenly snapped into sharp legal focus. Morrison had operated out of a private address in Lower Manhattan under a false practice name, E. M. Clark, M.D. A thread pulled from a receipt Mrs. Brennan had noticed months earlier among Mrs. Whitmore's effects, dismissed at the time as inconsequential. It was only when Fitzgerald's team ran the alias through public registries that the connection to the suspended physician was confirmed. More significantly, Fitzgerald discovered a financial link between Morrison and O'Brien. Over 24 payments made out to E.M. Clark were traced to the home's institutional accounts, hidden within line items for palliative consultation services. That was all the confirmation Fitzgerald needed. "We move at dawn," he told his team, his voice low and grim. "Quietly. No uniforms. I want everyone inside before a single alarm can be raised." The early hours of May 19, 1848 were thick with fog, a blessing for the half-dozen plainclothes detectives who surrounded the Blessed Widow's Christian home under cover of mist. Mrs. Brennan, already awake and dressed, waited by the service door at the rear of the kitchen, just as she had agreed with Fitzgerald 2 nights prior during a brief covert meeting in the alleyway near St. Patrick's Cathedral. By 5:30 a.m., the home was surrounded. At 5:43, Mrs. Brennan opened the door. What followed was executed with the precision of a military operation. One team secured the office, another moved to Kelly's quarters, a third apprehended Father Walsh during his morning prayers still in his robes. Margaret O'Brien was found in the sitting room, sipping her morning tea and reading correspondence by the hearth. She looked up, startled, not by the detectives, but by the sight of Mrs. Brennan stepping inside behind them, her expression hard as iron. "You, O'Brien," breathed, eyes narrowing with dawning comprehension. "Yes," Mrs. Brennan said evenly. "Me." The arrest was swift. O'Brien, Kelly, and Walsh were taken into custody with barely a word. Later, when O'Brien attempted to protest her innocence to Fitzgerald, claiming the women had misunderstood her generosity, he laid a single copy of the ledger in front of her. "Signed by your hand," he said. "You'll have every opportunity to explain it to the court. The trial that followed in the summer of 1848 gripped New York. Crowds gathered daily outside the courthouse. Newspapers published lurid serial coverage, and charitable homes across the country came under renewed scrutiny. The prosecution called 42 witnesses over 3 weeks, including bankers' lawyers, a handwriting expert, and 2 surviving family members of previous victims. But the most powerful testimony came from Sarah Brennan and Agatha Patterson, who entered the courtroom arm in arm on the 3rd day of the trial. Mrs. Brennan spoke plainly and without theatrics. She detailed everything from her discovery of the ledgers to the night she saved Mrs. Patterson's life. The courtroom fell silent when she read aloud the notation she had found next to her own name, potentially problematic due to intelligence and observational skills. May require special handling. The jury took less than 2 hours to return with the verdict: guilty on all counts. Brennan had previously described was all there untouched, damning, undeniable. Detective Fitzgerald himself stood in stunned silence for several moments as he took in the carefully organized files, the duplicate wills bearing forged signatures, the ledger entries noting causes of death like respiratory failure, administered final dose 1:30 a.m., and chilling phrases such as "no surviving heirs," "full estate secured." It was no longer a matter of belief. The evidence stacked floor to ceiling in that hidden alcove made the conspiracy undeniable. Among the documents were even letters referencing Sister Margaret in Philadelphia, outlining exit strategies and warning about compromised operatives. A map marked with red pins showed homes across the eastern seaboard, suspected to be part of the network Morrison had spoken about. The scale of the operation surpassed even Fitzgerald's grim expectations. Aftermath and justice. The trial of Margaret O'Brien, Catherine Kelly, and the man calling himself Father Patrick Walsh became one of the most sensational court cases in New York's history. Held at the Court of General Sessions in late 1848, the case drew national attention. Newspapers dubbed it the Widow's Web, and reporters from Boston, Philadelphia, and even London crowded into the gallery. The courtroom overflowed daily. Mrs. Brennan and Mrs. Patterson testified at length. Mrs. Brennan, in particular, became a symbol of resilience and moral courage, an ordinary woman who risked everything to stop a string of cold-blooded murders. "We trusted them," she said to the court. "We came to the home seeking peace and compassion, not to be harvested like crops for what little we had left." Catherine Kelly's outbursts during the trial, accusing Mrs. Brennan of senility and manipulation, only further convinced the jury of her guilt. Her knowledge of narcotics and calculated sedative use, confirmed by Morrison and toxicologists, sealed her fate. Father Walsh's true identity was revealed as Nathaniel Croft, a failed seminary student from Baltimore who had never been ordained and had previously been dismissed from 2 religious institutions for moral impropriety. His forged credentials and inconsistent liturgical Latin became symbolic of the entire sham. All 3 were found guilty on all charges, including conspiracy to commit murder fraud and criminal impersonation. Margaret O'Brien received life in prison at Sing Sing. Kelly and Croft were each sentenced to 25 years hard labor. Dr. Edmund Morrison received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation, but was barred from ever practicing medicine again in any capacity. He died in obscurity in a poorhouse 5 years later. Legacy and reform. The case prompted immediate outrage and calls for reform. In 1849, the New York State Legislature passed the Elder Protection and Institutional Accountability Act, which required state oversight and audits for all charitable institutions housing elderly or incapacitated persons, mandated that no will could be legally processed in favor of a charitable institution where the deceased resided unless reviewed by an independent probate officer. Introduced certification standards for religious counselors and medical staff in elder homes. By 1852, similar laws had been passed in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. Epilogue: Mrs. Brennan and Mrs. Patterson. Mrs. Brennan and Mrs. Patterson remained close friends after the trial. They moved into a small apartment in the Upper East Side, financed in part by a modest fund raised by a public grateful for their bravery, though both women had lost many friends and much trust. They had regained something more powerful, a sense of justice, and the knowledge that they had stopped a monster that had operated in plain sight. In her final years, Sarah Brennan became an outspoken advocate for elder care reform, writing a pamphlet titled "Trust and Treachery: My Years Inside the Widow's Home," which became a widely circulated document used in the training of inspectors and social workers for decades. She died peacefully in 1864 at the age of 79 in her own bed with Mrs. Patterson by her side, and this time no one forged her death certificate. The revelations from the hidden chamber beneath the Blessed Widow's Christian home shocked the nation to its core. The discovery of 52 meticulously documented victims, the organized graves, and the personal mementos preserved like trophies in a serial killer's shrine shattered any lingering doubt about the scope and depravity of the crimes. Newspapers across the country printed headlines like "Haven of Horror 52, Murdered in Charitable Home for Widows," "Bodies Beneath the Garden, New York's Largest Murder Conspiracy Unearthed," "Trust Betrayed, the Elderly Preyed Upon by the Pious." What made the case so chilling was not only the methodical nature of the killings, but the fact that the perpetrators had weaponized kindness, trust, and faith. The facade of Christian charity and genteel care concealed a machinery of death that had run efficiently and undetected for half a decade. The trial and national reckoning. The trial began in September of 1848 and lasted nearly 4 months. Courtrooms were packed daily with journalists, onlookers, and relatives of the victims. Survivors like Mrs. Brennan and Mrs. Patterson were heralded as heroes, their testimonies bringing jurors and, at times, the judge to tears. "We were not patients. We were not parishioners. We were accounts payable," Mrs. Brennan stated on the stand. "They measured our lives in dollars and ended them when the math was right." The prosecution presented the ledgers, burial maps, letters between conspirators, forged wills, and medical records as overwhelming evidence. Perhaps most damning of all were the artifacts found buried with the body's wedding rings, baby photos, and love letters, proof that the victims had not simply passed quietly into old age, but had been erased by design. The defense attempted to argue confusion, mental instability, and even jealousy on the part of Mrs. Brennan. But the scale of the evidence left no room for doubt. All three conspirators were found guilty on all counts. Margaret O'Brien was sentenced to death by hanging, but died in prison awaiting appeal. Catherine Kelly was sentenced to life imprisonment, where she spent her remaining years in a solitary psychiatric wing, reportedly tormented by hallucinations and paranoia. Patrick Walsh, real name Nathaniel Croft, received 25 years and died mysteriously, just 2 years into his sentence, rumored to have been poisoned by another inmate. Impact and legacy. The public outrage that followed led to sweeping legislative reforms. New York passed the Widows' Protection Act of 1849, which prohibited charitable institutions from receiving estates from residents unless independently verified and monitored. The case spurred the formation of the first state board of elder welfare, which later evolved into part of the modern Department of Social Services. Churches and religious organizations began vetting and certifying affiliated homes, establishing safeguards and oversight protocols. Elder advocacy groups began to form across the East Coast, using the widow's web case as a rallying cry for reform. The hidden burial chamber beneath the home was sealed but not forgotten. When the building was demolished in 1869, the city finally exhumed all 52 bodies. They were buried together in a public cemetery under a simple monument that read, "In memory of the forgotten." Their lives were stolen. May their names be remembered. The women who exposed the truth, Mrs. Sarah Brennan and Mrs. Esther Patterson, lived out the remainder of their days in quiet dignity, hailed as pioneers of elder justice. A small pension from the city and a flood of donations allowed them to live comfortably but modestly. In 1851, Mrs. Brennan published a memoir titled The House of Peace, The Chamber of Death, which became a national bestseller. It is still studied today in criminology and social work programs as one of the earliest first-person accounts of institutional betrayal and serial murder in elder care. When she died in 1864, her obituary in the New York Times simply read, "Sarah Brennan, aged 79, passed peacefully. She saved lives. She told the truth." The trial's fallout. A web of murder unraveled. Following the testimony of Mrs. Brennan and Mrs. Patterson, which laid the emotional and factual groundwork for the prosecution's devastating case, dozens of law enforcement agencies began reopening cold cases and quietly inspecting similar homes across the eastern seaboard. Within weeks, in Philadelphia, St. Catherine's Home for Elderly Women was raided. A hidden stairwell beneath the chapel led to a chamber where 32 bodies were found, all bearing similar signs of sedative overdose and altered wills. In Baltimore, the Sisters of Mercy Rest Home had quietly processed 18 natural deaths in the previous year alone, 14 of which involved sudden estate transfers to the institution. In Boston, the Marion House for Solitary Women was discovered to have received over $400,000 in bequests from elderly residents, many of whom had no known next of kin. Burial ledgers contained only first names, and many bodies had been cremated before families could be contacted. Every one of these homes had something in common: suspiciously spotless reputations, lavish donations to churches and civic charities, and administrators who vanished the moment law enforcement closed in. The trial's key revelations. Elizabeth Morrison, aka Margaret O'Brien, had first tested her method in a Philadelphia hospital where she worked in the 1830s. Her techniques escalating sedative dosages, estate manipulation, rapid burial had gone undetected because they were done under the guise of nursing care. Margaret Collins, aka Catherine Kelly, had used her experience with handling cadavers and mixing chemicals to create drug cocktails that mimicked natural causes of death. One physician who reviewed her notes remarked she had a clinical grasp of pharmacology that rivaled that of a university professor. James Murphy, aka Father Walsh, was perhaps the most chilling. A failed actor, he had used his theatrical background to impersonate a priest, delivering sermons, hearing confessions, and offering grief counseling while manipulating victims into rewriting their wills. A nation reacts, the public response was explosive. Editorials raged against the vulnerability of the elderly and the unchecked power of religious charities. Protests broke out in cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, demanding legislation to protect those living in care homes. Several churches were implicated in failing to properly vet institutions, receiving their endorsements, resulting in massive scandals and internal reforms. Within a year, a new federal law was passed, the Charitable Oversight and Estate Protection Act, 1849. This law required third-party legal counsel in all estate transfers from the elderly to care institutions, mandated regular inspections and audits of charitable homes, created the Office for Elderly Protection, the first federal body dedicated to the welfare of senior citizens, legacy of the survivors. Though they never sought recognition, Mrs. Sarah Brennan and Mrs. Esther Patterson became national symbols of courage. In 1850, they testified before a congressional committee on elder exploitation. In 1851, a fund was established in their names to support independent living grants for widowed and aging women. In 1874, a memorial plaque was unveiled at the former site of the Blessed Widows Christian Home, since demolished Reading, in honor of those who exposed darkness disguised as charity. Let no soul be forgotten. The shelter they helped establish offered temporary housing, legal support, and advocacy for women in need of protection while arranging their affairs or seeking safe permanent homes. Mrs. Brennan and Mrs. Patterson remained close friends for the rest of their lives. Bound by the trauma they survived and by the strength it took to expose it, they became outspoken advocates for the elderly, especially women living in institutions. Their story was not just one of survival, but of transformation, using their voices to shine a light on abuse cloaked in respectability. The case of the Blessed Widows Christian Home sent shockwaves through American society, fundamentally altering how the nation viewed institutional care, elder vulnerability, and the hidden dangers of unchecked trust. It revealed with chilling clarity how systemic abuse could thrive under the appearance of benevolence, and how social isolation, limited legal rights, and a culture of deference could be manipulated to silence and eliminate the most defenseless. In 19th century America, widows often had few legal protections, limited control over their finances, and little social power. Once their husbands died, many were left dependent on charity, and that dependency made them targets. The murders at the home showed how criminals could exploit not only the women themselves, but the very systems designed to protect them. The public outrage that followed led to sweeping reforms. Charitable institutions were now subject to routine inspections. Employee background checks became mandatory. Resident rights laws were enacted to protect against coercion, forced confinement, or retaliation for complaints. Changes in inheritance law also emerged. Wills now required independent witnesses and legal review, especially in cases where large donations or estate transfers were involved. Fraud became harder to commit and easier to detect. But perhaps the most important lesson was not legal, it was human. This case proved how vital it is to stay connected to those who are vulnerable. The same isolation that made these women easy targets also kept them hidden from outside help. Their lives might have been saved sooner if anyone had asked harder questions. Could a conspiracy like this still happen today? Our laws have evolved, our oversight improved. But the story of the Blessed Widow's Christian home is a reminder evil doesn't always come with a knife. Sometimes it wears a cross and offers tea. It reminds us that true safety comes not just from laws, but from vigilance, compassion, and a society that refuses to look away from the quiet suffering of its most forgotten members. Just when we thought the horror couldn't grow deeper, the hidden chamber beneath that Manhattan home revealed a vast, multi-state network. Hundreds of lives stolen for greed. Beneath the mask of Christian charity. If this story gave you chills, share it with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support our efforts to uncover America's forgotten crimes, and subscribe so you don't miss what history tried to bury. 52 women buried beneath the floors of that elegant house trusted their caregivers to protect them. Instead, they became victims of one of the most calculated murder operations in American history. Their story is a warning etched not in stone, but in silence and ledgers. And if justice was delayed, it was not denied. Their truth is now known, their names remembered, their suffering not in vain. What do you think? Could stronger oversight have prevented these crimes? Or were the social structures of the 1840s simply too frail to offer real protection? Let us know in the comments. And if you'd like more stories like this one about America's darkest secrets and most chilling truths, let us know. Until next time, remember history still holds secrets, and justice, though late, can still speak for the dead.